All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Digital Child ACMI Public Seminar on Australian EdTech for Better Digital Childhoods. My name is Andy Zhao. I'm a research fellow at the Deakin University node of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child. Before we begin today's seminar, I'd like to invite you to watch an acknowledgement of our country video from Deakin University.
Deakin University would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies, and waterways on which our students and staff come together. As we learn, teach, innovate, and research through virtually and physically constructed places across time, we pay our deep respect to the elders and ancestors who have cared for the country that you join us from. An ancient place where education, innovation, and knowledge transfer have taken place for many thousands of years. At Deakin, we aim to nurture and continue this important legacy whilst encouraging our communities to walk softly on country in the spirit of sustainability. In particular, we give gratitude to the elders and ancestors of Wadawurrung country, Wurundjeri country, and Eastern Maar country and beyond, where our physical campuses are located. Their contributions to our learning communities and environments are rich and highly valued. Deakin is committed to embedding Indigenous knowledges and perspectives in all disciplines that we teach, as well as advancing the self-determined interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including treaty and truth-telling. As you move around our physical and virtual environments, take a moment to consider, appreciate, and listen deeply to the country beneath your feet.
I'd also like to pay my personal respects and gratitude to the Wurundjeri and Burwoorn people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we are gathered today. This is the second seminar held here with our partner ACMI, who we want to thank for hosting us, and we look forward to more events and collaborations in the future. The seminar is also part of a series of events hosted by the RC Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child to celebrate the Children's Week. We are very pleased to welcome you here today in person. Please note that this event is being recorded, and we also have many participants joining us online. The Australian Research Council funded Centre for the Digital Child brings stakeholders together from all sectors of the society to help create healthy, educated, and connected futures for all Australian children. The Centre is funded for 7 years and brings together 6 universities from 4 states, as well as a range of international universities, commercial and civil society organisations, and partners from Commonwealth and state government. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you today's panel. On my right-hand side, chair of the panel, Professor Julian Sefton-Green, Professor of New Media Education at Deakin University and co-lead of the Connected Program at the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child. Dr. McAuley, CEO and founder of TalkiPlay. Mark Woodland, founder of Xplor. Simon Torok, Senior Account Manager in Education Technology at Google. Annabel Astbury, Head of Digital Education at the ABC, and Professor Susan Edwards, Director of the Early Childhood Futures Research Program at the Australian Catholic University and Associate Investigator of the Centre. Now I'll hand over to Professor Julian Sefton-Green to begin the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Andy, and good afternoon, everybody. And I also just want to thank Andy very much for stewarding and bringing this event together, and we all appreciate his help here. So my job today is I'll do a little bit of context setting, and then I will ask the panelists some questions, and then they'll talk, obviously, in answer to the questions, if we're lucky. And hopefully, and then towards the end of the session, we'll have opportunities for question and answer, both online and from the people in the room. So just to set the context, we want to make the point, really, that childhood is digital by default. Families and children are using digital devices, often online, at play, in the home, in early years centres, communicating with family members, learning, shopping, getting advice, monitoring growth, and interacting with welfare services. All of these kinds of interactions and experiences use apps and technologies developed here in Australia and often elsewhere. The conversation today, we want to explore markets and opportunities for EdTech and edutainment for the often neglected age group, 0 to 8-year-olds. We want to delve a little bit more into understanding family uses of digital technologies and the uses and purposes of EdTech in early years settings. We want to think how we balance terms like learning, play, or fun in the home. We want to think a little bit about technological innovation and opportunities as these technologies, which are familiar to us today, are going to continue to develop. And we also want to reflect on ethical and social uses of the technology. You all know, probably better than I, how much the COVID pandemic accelerated the use and take-up of EdTech technologies in all educational settings, in early childhood centres, in the care sector. Service providers have increasingly partnered with EdTech providers to integrate technological solutions in documenting learning, communicating with the family, how to organise institutions and staff, plan programming, and so on. Many people have spent a lot of time thinking precisely how these processes can be achieved. At home, parents and caregivers have been bewildered and faced with a huge variety of consumer EdTech products, making informed decision-making incredibly difficult. So in the conversation which we want to initiate today, we want to ask how educational are educational apps? What pedagogical, what teaching and learning approaches are embedded in platforms? How do we know what the quality of digital play and learning is? How do we know if our data is being misused? At the same time, developers and company owners want to know how their products can meet the educational needs of early childhood educators, parents, and of course, children in very different and diverse settings. So we hope and we believe that the panelists today represent some of the most active participants in these discussions. We have representatives from a national broadcaster, that's Annabel at the end there. We've got representatives from national and global industries, which is going to be Simon in the middle there from Google. And we have scholars and family and early learning, Susie, sandwiched between Simon and the ABC, yeah. And then we also have representatives from other sized companies, so Mark from Xplor and Annie from TalkiPlay, who will obviously talk more about their work. We're going to begin, I think I've been very, and you'll have to forgive me, sort of sizist in economic terms. So we're going to start petite with TalkiPlay, and then we're going to grow to the behemoth that is Google, encompassing the ABC, because it's not in Google's size range. And then we'll end with Susie's kind of reflections from an educator's perspective on this conversation, which is often awkward, often difficult, often brilliant, and often kind of innovative, on how the markets and learning are ever so more frequently becoming closely entwined. After Susie's reflected back to you all, we'll have a little bit of an opportunity for the panelists to make a final riposte, and then we're going to invite Rebecca Ng, who's sitting over there in the front, who's a colleague with us at the Centre of Excellence, who's going to offer first thoughts, a sort of design prototype of a database that she, Andy, and Gavin, who sit in the front there, have been preparing, trying to bring together an overview of the EdTech marketplace and EdTech apps for use across the country. So I'm going to begin by asking Annie, and I presume an easy question, so there's no reason to look alarmed, which is just, could you please just give us an overview of TalkiPlay, and you'll explain what it is to people who don't know, and explain why you wanted to invent and make it and bring it to market. And what's your vision regarding the role of technology in young children's everyday play and learning?
Excellent, thank you. Hi, I'm Dr. Annie McAuley. And yes, I'm definitely the shortest here and the smallest company, but our innovation is enormous, I promise. I am the founder and CEO of TalkiPlay. I, at 18, was an elite athlete. So I was a downhill skier. Anything that went fast was definitely for me. Exhilarating, and anything I could put, my muscles behind down the slopes was what I wanted to do. Unfortunately, it led with me having a traumatic brain injury, and I lost the ability to walk and talk because of it. And it took a lot of rehabilitation to get those things back. And you'd think that the walking would be the hardest because I'd been so sporty, but actually talking was way harder. I was suddenly an outsider in everything in life. So people would talk over me. They would talk for me. And I was part of the world, but not of the world. And I worked really hard to get back into the world. So much so that I went on to study at university, even though I was in rehab at the time. And I went on to do a PhD in medicine. I've worked at some amazing hospitals, at the INEA for 10 years, at the Children's Hospital, and my last position was a fellow at the Alfred Hospital in Emergency and Trauma. During that, I had 2 children, and it was my second child, Grace, that broke me. She was a force of nature to bring into this world. She was so hard. And between, working at the hospital, both my husband and I was home with the kids during the day, having worked all night, and she was just lying on the floor, tantruming and crying because she couldn't communicate. She, like 1 in 5 young children, had a language delay, and she really struggled to communicate her basic wants, how she was feeling, what she needed, and I couldn't help her. And I felt overwhelming sense of need to help her because I knew what it felt like to not be able to communicate. And I was almost at a mess because I didn't know what to do. It was my son that came up from behind me as I was crying into my coffee one day, and he hugged me and he said, "Everything's going to be fine." Now, if your 4-year-old hugs you, you know this is not a high point in your life, that the 4-year-old has to comfort you. So I felt even worse. But what he said changed our lives forever. And he said, "Mum," he loves going to the theatre, by the way, "Mum, what we're going to do is we're going to make the whole house talk, kind of like Beauty and the Beast, Mum. And so you won't have to point at the table and say table, and you won't have to pass her the cup and say cup, cup. It's going to talk to her, and she's going to talk to it. And then the 2 of us are going to run around in this magical house and talk together." Because what I hadn't realised is he also couldn't play with her. And I hugged him and said, "Beautiful boy, let's map it out and draw it together." But what I knew is that was something of fantasy and not something that was a reality. But I went back that night and I thought, how good would it be? And like every researcher, I went and did a systematic meta-analysis on it. And what I discovered was that, articles around motivational learning in autism were coming up, associative learning. And I thought, this is not a bad idea. If it's talking at the same time that you see it and you touch it and you're hearing it all at once, that's actually a really great way to learn and not such a bad idea. So I stayed up for weeks and weeks and weeks, and I built the technology behind it, and I made it happen. So now if you take a TalkiPlay and you go tap it on a table, it's off at the moment, otherwise it'd be speaking to us, it will say table. And it'll say, "Hi, I'm a table," and something different each time you tap it, but also with repetition. And if you tap a chair, it'll do that. The toilet is the favourite because it says, "Flush me." And we do dinosaurs, and we have high expectations for kids, even if they're non-verbal. So you can learn a lot of information about a dinosaur that, it can help you make a friend. And you'd be surprised that dinosaur information is the best thing that makes friends on a playground when you're 4 years old. We are play-based learning, and a way that children can use their imagination to help them thrive. Because these children, particularly those with language delay, are given a low expectation. And, if we're giving them the opportunity and enabling the environment for them, acting as that third teacher in the room, we give them a future that they might not have otherwise. And my quest is that I could help, children with language delay thrive. And that's why I do what I do.
Thank you very much indeed. I kind of think we have to have a round of applause for that because... But we're now going to change tenor, and I'm now going to ask Mark to talk. And Mark has founded a company called Xplor, which is Xplor. And this was born here in Melbourne in 2016. But in the past 7 years, it's grown into an international business. So I'd like Mark to tell us a little bit about the story behind Xplor and how also he thinks a company like Xplor has grown in response to curriculum or school reform in Australia. And also perhaps speculate a little bit about how you think it might respond to future needs and challenges faced by childcare centres and educators in Australia.
Yeah, hard act to follow, but and Xplor's not wasted on me that we can't spell. So Xplor, but startup land, you just drop the vowels and you get a really cool startup name. So it's Xplor, but my story begins with my mother, which is probably every single person in this room. But she was a school teacher, and she was a school teacher her whole life. She started off as a kindergarten teacher and went through the schooling ranks, for lack of a better word, and eventually became a principal of a school. And so she did her 20, 30 years in that career, single mother, so dealing with two teenage boys. And she eventually got to the end of her career and retired. And she really wanted to continue what she loved, which was teaching children, helping families, that whole ecosystem that exists. So being the passionate teacher, not the savvy businesswoman, she said, I'll open up a childcare centre. Open up a childcare centre as a retirement plan. And so she found a 33-place childcare centre here in Melbourne in Croydon. I don't know, smaller than this room. And for those that aren't familiar with what 33 places means, that's 33 children that come into your childcare centre each day, and you look after 33. So small in the scheme of childcare centres. But she bought this business in 2010, so for technology people, that's when the iPad first came out, so just put technology into context. And so technology is quite new. So I was listening to my mum call me every single afternoon because she quickly realised that the majority of her job wasn't teaching and doing the things that she loved. It was chasing enrolments, helping parents, navigating the magical system of government subsidies, and all the administration that sits around and the regulation that sits around the sector. And so I was in the Australian Army at this point, listening to my mum complain. And the story I tell the media is I'm a super loving son and I love my mother, so that's why I left the army to help her. The truth is I was just sick of the whinging every single afternoon about how hard business was. So I made the grand statement, and there's a few of these grand statements in this story, of how hard could it possibly be to run a business. So I left the army and joined my mother in her business, and I was the receptionist, I was the administrator. And every day, parents would come through the front door, they'd sign on a piece of paper the time that they would arrive, their name next to it, and then at the end of the day, they'd sign the time they left. And then I'd take that piece of paper and manually enter it into a database, and I was hating life. And that's all I would do. I'd run around the childcare centre counting how many children are in rooms and how many educators were with each child, thinking, what have I done? So I made another grand statement of how hard could it be to automate this with software. So I approached an app developer. They quoted me a stupid amount of money that I wish I took to this day because it was quite cheap in the scheme of things. But I couldn't afford it at that point of time. And so I taught myself how to code and wrote a platform that allowed parents to walk through the front door using Bluetooth beacons. So you Bluetooth in your car. When you get into a car, your Bluetooth automatically connects. So when you walk through the front door, it signs you in, and when you walk out, it signs you out. Not rocket science, not SpaceX, but it meant I wasn't doing manual administration anymore, and it worked. So that allowed me to get off my seat and go and talk to educators for the first time, because Army, not education, had no idea what they were doing. So I asked them, what was your day like? What are you doing? And they had all these clipboards and post-it notes and all this stuff around the childcare centre. And they said, we're documenting children's learning. I said, when do you teach? When do you work with the children? When do you play? Oh, in between all this. I said, okay. Another grand statement. That doesn't feel right, so leave it with me. So we wrote an app that allowed educators to document their learning, take photos and observations and documentation, and that gave them time back in their day. And then finally the parents came every day. They would call me, how's little Johnny going? Now, public statement, I've called all those parents back because I'm a father now. And I do it to my childcare centre, saying, how's Alexander? Is he all right? He was a bit upset when he dropped off. And they say the same thing, it's fine, go back to work. And I wasn't as tactful because I was straight from a combat role in defence. And I'd only worked with males, angry males, ready to stab people. And so my response to these parents was harden up and get back to work. So... but then it was obvious, parents just deeply cared. They wanted to connect with their children, they wanted to understand, they wanted to help. And so we opened up the platform that allowed the parent to get the communication that the educators were documenting. And that was life. And so in 2012, we bought a childcare centre that was 100 places, so 3 times the size. Then I made another grand statement of how hard could this be, and opened a 200-place childcare centre on St Kilda Road. And so we had a 12-storey building, and the rooftop was our playground, and level 11 was our main childcare centre. And this sounds terrible, but all our babies were in the basement. And it wasn't a bad basement, but it was just called basement on the lift. And so we were transporting 200 children up and down. It was a nightmare. B for baby. Didn't have that brainwave. B for baby, not basement. And anyway, the technology built out over time, automating more and more administration. So in 2016, I sold those childcare centres, put all that money into Xplor and launched Xplor. I had some venture capitalists, some great people from Airtree, invest some money to scale it, because it turned out my very small problem in a childcare centre happened to be the same problem every single person was facing, not just in Australia, but around the world. And then in 2019, I had some private equity come on board. They acquired my company and helped us grow into the second largest early years platform in the world. We've got about 17,000 childcare centres on the platform now, Australia, New Zealand, doing amazing things and being able to expand that. But to answer the question, it's why I tell the story, is the only reason I got into education was the help. And I think with policy and all the reform and all the 1,000 things that happen, especially in tech, I can talk for tech, I'm not going to talk for educators because I'm not one, but there's a lot of ego attached to tech, there's a lot of money attached to technology, lots of fancy valuations, it's all nonsense. Because really what technology at the core of it is to help. It's to automate the things that people shouldn't be doing so they can do the things that they love. That's what we got in for it, and that's what we do today. I'm now in healthcare in the NDIS, so I'd love to have a chat. But it's the same concept. All we care about is helping. So when we go to do reform and policy, it might be an idea just to, not saying you guys do it, but in general, now, just drop the ego. It doesn't matter whose idea wins, because at the end of the day, we're just trying to improve education. And that's probably worth it in the long run. It doesn't matter if your idea wins or my idea wins. It doesn't really matter. What matters is ultimately the best outcome for the child is there. And that's sort of how we look at all the problems that we solve today.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that's grand. Now, I don't think Simon's going to tell us a personal story about how he founded Google.
I was a small boy in a garage.
I could be wrong, but what do I know? So look, we're now going to change scale, and this is kind of one of the interesting challenges about this whole sector, that we have a mixture of different levels of commitment and interest and personal values alongside huge amounts of money. So we're going to change the lens a little bit with the next sets of questions. So Simon, companies like Google have obviously been somewhat influential in global education. Two questions, really. What do you think its interest is in the early learning sector in Australia? And what special responsibilities do you think this sector poses for the company?
Hi. So I'm going to answer from my own perspective, because then I can be interesting and colourful. If I answer on behalf of the company, which I'm not allowed to do, it will be very dull and very boring. So if everybody's okay with that, I'm going to speak from my own perspective. When it comes to early education and how I perceive that Google works within that space. So my role is I work in the EdTech space, working with companies like TalkiPlay, like with Xplor, to get to assist them from an infrastructure perspective. Very boring, extremely boring, but necessary. Cloud infrastructure is such an important part of how everybody does everything nowadays. You know, you don't have servers that are set up that you need to manage. It's all done online. It's all done in the cloud. But when it comes to education, we have my counterpart Kevin and I, we have a real vested interest in the EdTech space. We've both worked in education, in and around the education space for the last 10 years for me and probably 15, 20 for Kev. We are emotionally invested in it. So when I met Annie a couple of months ago now, and I first learned about TalkiPlay, I was absolutely gobsmacked at this product and immediately I thought of about 5 or 6 use cases where this could personally assist me or people that I know. And being able to see products like that exist, and be able to, in any way that we can help those companies grow and get bigger and be the best that they can possibly be, absolutely. I'm more than able and willing to help in that regard. Xplor, for example, is one of the most commonly used apps in our house, because we have multiple children at multiple different venues that go, I've got 4 kids, so we're around everywhere. And each one has their own Xplor location that you can easily tap on your phone, and sign them in, see information, and it's amazing. So when it comes to the lens of why is Google invested in this area, it's because we want to help. Google has been in the education space for a very long time, from Google for Education perspective, so classroom, workspace, all of that fun stuff. But then there's also the Chromebooks, which is becoming the leader in the global education space. You'd think, oh, it's Microsoft, or it's laptops, or whatever it is, but the Chromebook is the most accessible device around. It's low cost, it's high function, and it's completely easy to manage, maintain, and deploy to a school system. There are enormous benefits to having an education platform built into hardware, because the two become seamless. You have no differentiation between the device that you use and the content that you're consuming. And the coolest part of that is that you get it all in one place. Sorry, what was the other question that you asked?
One question is about your interest in the early learning sector. And then the second question is around what special responsibilities do you think this sector poses the company?
Gotcha. Okay, so to refocus and talk about the thing that he asked me, the focus for Google, from my perspective, is that this is an important part of growing up. Education is so key, and it's such an integral part of growing and being able to interact with people, from young, small people as well. I've got a bunch of them at home. Being able to see their learning journey and being able to give them access to the information, the technology, is absolutely paramount to becoming grown up nowadays. You know, growing up, I didn't have the internet in the same capacity that my kids do. It was much more cut down. There was no Google at that point. I sound like an old person, because I am. And the idea is that you have the access to this information is enormous. You've got YouTube, you've got Google, you have the ability to find anything, anywhere in the world at any given time. And the coolest thing about that is that you then have enormous access. But with that, you need to be logical and safe about it. So child safety is an important part. Getting children to understand how to use these platforms when from a young age is paramount. It helps develop them and give them the ability to be safe online. It gives them the ability to know what is important to look at and what is suitable for them to be able to look at. As a parent as well, you can limit that access, you can guide that access, you can give them access to particular things. But then from a company perspective, it has always been a focus of Google and will hopefully continue to be.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. I'm now going to ask Annabel Astbury from the ABC to talk. And you'll all know that in many respects, children's television is the precursor in some respects of some of the specialized, dedicated products made for the child audience, both with an inflection on education and also for entertainment in the home. So it's not surprising that a national broadcaster has this long-standing interest in the digital field. So I've got a couple of questions and around quality a bit. We're going to start with the question, drawing on your experience developing media content for Australian children as a national broadcaster, what criteria do you use to define good content?
Well, thank you, Julian, and welcome everybody. Oh, it's good to see you. It's good to see some familiar faces in the audience. Before I get to the question about the criteria that I think we use and apply to content, I feel like a bit of an outlier in this group because I'm a K-12 educator. That's my background. I was a history teacher, and I then started working at the ABC, rolling out one of the biggest digital education sort of platforms, or I guess bank of resources for teachers to use in the classroom. And during that experience, we were also invited to actually make a lot of digital games, educational games. And Julian, in your introduction, you used the word edutainment, and it's a word that I have a lot of problems with because I don't think education needs to be made more appealing by having an entertaining word. Also, it's a made-up word. It's also not a very good word. But education can be fantastic, and entertainment is fantastic. But I think really we have to start reassessing our use of the word edutainment, because it always then later on, and because of the schooling systems and the way that they change, it actually has a very bad impact on the development of digital games within the K-12 space. And it has a very sort of negative impact. So you end up with a lot of bad digital games in the K-12 space, or especially in the K-6 space. So the criteria that we use, and I'm using this as the basis, and keeping in mind that over the past really 10 years, the ABC hasn't had the opportunity to be able to develop a lot of digital games, especially in the 0 to 8 space. Certainly we have a lot of online sort of associated content, associated with shows. But I think one of the most successful and one of the last sort of, I guess, keystone like apps that we used was Play School Art Maker, which my senior producer, Amy Nelson, spearheaded. And we've just been sort of investigating, developing some new games for the sort of K-4 space and for preschool space as well. And we were really delighted to see that Play School Art Maker, even though it hasn't been updated in so many years, is still a favourite amongst early childhood educators and especially university students. So the criteria that we use, of course, goes back to the charter of the ABC, which is to educate, entertain and inform all Australians. And we want our content, like our screen content, we want it to be authentic Australian voices that represents the experiences of Australian people, that excites and delights the audiences around them, especially for young people. And we want, well, for me, from the education space, we want that to be, we want that to spark curiosity as well. And for me, especially within the early childhood space, I want to show the the benefit that digital games can bring to developmental learning. And so I think one of the key criteria for it to be a successful educational game, and this has borne out certainly for the spaces that we've been working in, the K to 12 space. And there's one of my former colleagues here. We've got lots of experience of knowing what works and what doesn't work. And what doesn't work is when you either have only digital creators creating the game or only game makers. You have to involve educators, you have to involve the parent community, and so it becomes a very delicate collaboration between all of the groups who are involved, because they all have differing expectations, experience and skills to bring to make a successful educational game. And I think you would see that, you'd certainly see that with ArtMaker. We've certainly explored with some of our other flagship programs in the early childhood space that may or may not begin with B. But Bluey. Just in case. We've been looking at that and looking at the way that we can capitalise on making the digital game such a compelling experience that it inspires and invokes creativity away from the screen as well. And so that's what we think, these are some of the, really good criteria that makes. But I also think the space in educational gaming is changing. And we're currently working on, we're also working on a maths game at the moment in collaboration with Monash University and a small games company called Art of Play. And I think this is going to be an interesting experiment in that we're going to be making online games, but we're also bringing the teacher into focus as well, because we know that, and especially within early childhood settings as well, you don't want individual children on, you don't want in your mum's childcare centre 30 people on an iPad, because we know that it's so much more than that. But it's about involving the educators within their technology and getting them to demonstrate and play together. Playing together within an educational setting not only engages and excites the children, but it engages and excites the educator as well. So, yeah.
Thanks, Annabel. And we divided up the questions, and you may think you've answered this, but I said I'd come back with a secondary question about whether you apply the same notions of good and bad play to all platforms, and if not, where the key fissures, breaks might be.
Yeah. Well, I think that the key fissures are, and certainly in the experience that I've had when we've made educational games, especially for that K-3 market, which is a much more formal setting, and for some reason the wonder and curiosity does seem to disappear with educational apps in that space, which I hope it doesn't. I think there's a very big opportunity there for, especially for creative people who are in the audience or who are listening online. But I think the biggest fissure comes when educators are not involved in that process. And so even if I think of our wonderful colleague at ABC Kids, Laura Stone, who's an early childhood educator, she understands the needs, and she understands the needs of educators, but she also has a deep understanding of the development of a child's mind, of their skills, and of what they desire and what they can and can't learn and should be exposed to. So I think, to me, if you don't have that collaboration, that's going to have the biggest gap, and it's also going to have the biggest fissure there that, it won't be educational. And that's not saying that entertainment is bad. Entertainment is great. But also, I would argue with all content, especially content that we do at the ABC, I would hope that all content that we make is educational in some sense. And I will use Bluey as an example, that from Bluey, yes, it's very entertaining. It's 7 minutes. It's that perfect. I've had a parent say to me, "No, I love Bluey because it's 7 minutes that I can put them in front of the TV and make dinner," and that's fine too. That's a very practical reason. But what about, you know, the curiosity and wonder and the play, or the interactions between humans that, you know, is obviously coming from that content? I would want all of those elements to come from Bluey as it comes from any drama or comedy or piece of news that we make.
Thanks very much, Annabel. And it's a perfect cue in a way to introduce Susie to talk from an academic and early childhood educator perspective. I guess listening to you all, I'm a little bit upset about how nice you all are. You're all, thank goodness, Susie. Because we asked Susie to think a little bit about the closer relationship between the organising and funding of early childhood education and digital technologies, that there's a changing relationship between how the money follows the student and where the money is spent in that kind of sense. So, and I wondered, Susie, if you could perhaps talk to us about how you see the kind of futures you'd want to see for Australian digital childhood, and also especially whether you have any views on how families can position themselves in this discussion given their relative lack of power in these marketplaces.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you for the invitation to speak, and thank you for the comments from all the invited guests today. And I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're on today. Now, so I'm going to frame this response in 3 parts, because the question I've given is the one that Julian just spoke of, so around the organising and funding of EC and digital technologies, futures, and families. So I've got just 3 pieces that I want to speak to. So for the first question, which is around what's going on here, where we have tech, money, education and care. Like, they're all pretty big concepts, aren't they? Tech's big, money's big. If you've got it, it's big. If you haven't got it, I reckon it's even bigger. And early childhood education and care, because I've been a kindergarten teacher for a very long time, to me is an incredibly important thing in any society. And we know that education and care has been happening on these lands for many thousands of years. So the fact that children play, and the fact that children learn and grow, and the fact that adults help them learn and grow is not new, despite the fact that we have a lot of tech now flooding this particular environment. So children have been being born and playing and learning and growing and for many, many thousands of years. So to help sort of think about the relationship with what I've broadly sort of said is early childhood tech and money, people have been hanging out with me a bit, probably so sick of me talking about philosophy of technology. I'm so sorry, Louise, I'm so sorry. But, you know, that's where my head is at the moment, so you asked me to talk, so you have to follow my head. So philosophy of technology is a body of knowledge in its own right. When I went to university at Bundoora RMIT to do my first degree in education, no one talked about technology, but I was taught theories of play and theories of learning and development. Mostly it was Piaget, Part, and a couple other dead white men. And Vygotsky was just on the horizon, so everyone was just starting to maybe think about the role of culture and society. Can you imagine it? That was quite cutting edge. It always used to do my head in, because before we moved to RMIT Bundoora, I was at Coburg, and we would sit in the classroom, and if you looked out the window, you could see into the Pentridge, into the exercise yard, and so I used to you get these lectures about the importance of education. Just look out the window into Pentridge. That's a defining moment of the importance of education in practice. So nobody talked about technologies or philosophy of technology, and still today, even in our society, everyone knows that we're living in a very digital world. In the education of our teachers, we don't give our teachers or even ourselves theoretical tools that help us think about technology. And so what most of us wander around with for how we think about tech and how we design tech and how tech is going to help other people in terms of like Xplor or TalkiPlay, is that technology is either good or bad. So this is what's called technological determinism, and the idea is that tech will determine whatever it is we want to happen. And that determinant can be for the good, so we can see this awful situation where communication is a challenge, and we can think, how can we use tech to make that situation better? Or you can see that you've had to enter all that data at the end of the day and go, why am I doing this every single day? I was the same person yesterday, right? It's the same person today. I'm still entering it. So I can do something with tech that will make that better. Or then you have the arguments where people might say, oh, the tech is really bad and it causes bad things, and this is where you come to issues like if the content's crap. Oh, no, not meant to swear here, sorry. If the content is not very good, then that's having bad outcomes for the children, right? So that's technological determinism. Now, the problem with that is it locks us in to an either-or way of thinking. So we can either only sit here and endlessly forever go, if you make good content, you have good outcomes, or if we can fix this problem with an app, then the system will run better. And we'll just be having the same conversation, I promise you, in 10 years. Well, I can't promise you that, but I reckon theoretically that could happen. So anyway, philosophy of technology has different ways of thinking about tech apart from technological determinism. And the one that I particularly like is the work by Professor Andrew Feenberg at Simon Fraser University. So there's just two concepts now that I would like to invite you in to consider that he offers, and then we'll think about what that looks like in relation to this question of early childhood, money and technology. Is that okay? So is everyone following so far? We'll keep going. Okay, so what Feenberg invites us to think is that technology is not something that just lands out of space and suddenly you have a TalkiPlay or you have an Xplor. He says that technologies always come from people. If there were no people, there would be no technologies. That's what we have to remember, right? If we were to all die, and the odds are not looking good, I have to say, for society at the moment, but we have plagues, floods, wars, disasters, inflation. It's enough to give you a little heart palpitation. So if we were to all die, the technology would stop, because the technology comes from the people. That's what we have to remember. There's an inherent relationship between humanity and technology. And so because the technology comes from people, Feenberg talks about the fact that there are always values. Human values are embedded in the tech. And there's two aspects to this. One is the design values. So if people don't just invent a tech for the fun of it. They don't just go, yeah, today I'm going to invent a TalkiPlay, right? You could see very, very clearly from Annie's very powerful story of her own experience of being voiceless and then her child's experience of being voiceless, that the invention of that piece of technology came from a deep held need to engage, to help, to support, to facilitate communication. So there's a human value in the design, right? Same with Xplor. He was jack of it, right? It's not quite as emotional, sorry, as Annie's, but you did say he came from the army. That, you had enough. You're just walking around and repeating process after process and process and going, actually, this can be automated, right? So there's a value in the design. But the problem with the technology is that just because it's designed with a value in mind doesn't mean that that when the user comes to that technology, that it's used in the same way, right? So Feenberg talks about this in his work around what was called the Minitel in France. And the Minitel was a thing that the French government introduced around about the 1980s. It's called the mini telephone. and they rolled one out to every household. Imagine this happened from our beautiful Labor government, that in the spirit of democracy, everyone gets a Minitel in their house. And the idea was that the Minitel would be your direct portal to government services. So instead of like, you know, dying, waiting to deal with your robo-debt or whatever, any service that you need. That's a beautiful example, actually, of design and use value, robo-debt, that you would ring up the Minitel and say, where's my pension, or, you know, I need a payment for my health or whatever. So that was the design value. What happened when it was rolled out was that the French people took to the Minitel with gusto, absolute gusto. It was very highly used, but the use value did not match the design value, because the reason that the Minitel was used with such gusto was everyone used it to hook up with each other for sex. Okay? So the design value does not assume the use value. It's connecting people. It's all about the tech and the people. Okay? So you have to bear in mind, see how far we are now from technological determinism. So we're not saying this tech is good or this tech is bad. Okay? We're saying someone has designed something because they value something, but when it hits the user, the use value and the design value don't always align. Sometimes they align perfectly. So if you know the history of the iPad and how that was influenced by a lot of the thinking around early childhood education, you'll know that the use value for the child and design value is a really nice fit, which is why they love it. So keep coming with me now. Come back to the... Am I going way over time too? Oh, that's not too bad. So we've got early childhood, we've got the money, and we've got the technology, right? So when you've got this thing about the values, what Feenberg talks about is when a technology enters a context that it hasn't been in before, so you've got early childhood education as a context where an app like Xplor has not been before, or a thing like Google has not been before, or something like TalkiPlay has not been before, right? So you have a context that already has all its own histories, all its own philosophies, all its own practices. It's been doing its thing for years and years and years and years, right? And that has all its own like stories and peaks and troughs and dramas and whatever. But here it is, and then the technology enters it. And the technology's entering it with its design value, right? Can you see what's going to happen? Because then in early childhood, you've got so many users, right? And you think you've got these nominally, innocently, happily, helpfully designed technologies come in here. But in that space then, okay, so you've got the children, you've got the families, you've got the educators, you've got all the government services and all the government systems. So you think that we might have designed something to solve one particular problem, but if that design value, so the idea that we can, you know, automate things, which is terrific, comes into this existing system, the design and the use values conflict. And what Feenberg talks about is then you develop what's called a technical code. And a technical code can become a bit of an issue, because what happens is people will look at the new tech and they might go, that's great, try to use it, or they'll go, oh, we're not too sure how to react to that, but what we'll do is we'll take what the knowledge we've had for centuries and centuries, and we'll wrap that new tech in what we already know. Okay? And what a technical code, there's so many technical codes. Like everywhere I go now in early childhood, I'm going, oh my God, technical codes. So here's a technical code for you. If you take digital documentation, an app that says the teachers can take photos and do all these things and put it up there and communicate it easily to parents, what happens is that actually the notion of documentation in early childhood education is not simply one about documenting in terms of the fact that I can capture visually what I see in a photo. The notion of documentation in early childhood education is that I, as a professional early childhood educator, have in-depth knowledge about learning, development and play. That means when I see a child doing or playing something, I'm interpreting a pedagogical relationship of the child to the other and the experience that they're having that I would once have documented on paper for the purpose of extending learning, not necessarily to take a photo that then is shot off to other people to go, Freddie's having a really lovely day. And so what happens with your technical code is that the new technology comes in, but all the old ways wrap up that technology, and while we thought we were solving a problem, which you did, we can also create new ones, because then to what extent, then we have to ask all these questions all the time, is the documentation using the app fulfilling a different purpose to what it was actually, what documentation was meant to be pedagogically. So that's a really long-winded answer to my question about what's happening between the relationship between the money, the education and the technology, because the money can drive the fact that we're trying to solve all these problems in ECC, but actually we need to make sure that we're having a really critical stance on what, how that is unfolding when it all meets. I've probably used all my time on the first bit, so 3 minutes. Should I do 3 more? I've got 2 more pieces. Should I say them or not? But just kick me. I'll just talk, and then when my time's definitely finished, just hit me on the leg.
I don't think I'm going to do that. I think you're going to be brief and
I'll
succinct.
be, all right, because I was really long then, I'm sorry. But that, to me, they're really important ideas. And I keep banging on about philosophy of technology a lot, to a lot of people. But I think that concepts are important, right? And philosophy of tech is concepts, and we have to think with concepts. All right, so I have 2 more quick points that I will make then. So one was about the futures. What are the futures? What I'll just say about this is, for me, it has to absolutely be on equity and access. Australian Digital Child Futures, equity, access. Everyone doesn't have fair access to the same tech. Everyone doesn't have the same stable access to the internet. And part of equity and access is also what are the knowledges and practices that your adults who are around you have and know to share and communicate with and about tech. So that was pretty brief. I did that, not too bad. And then I'll just quickly speak to the last one, is families. And I really liked Annabel's points around how important it was to bring educators into all of the design processes, because the point that I wanted to say about families was that it has to be a triad. In early childhood education and care, we talk about the triad. It's the child, it's the family, and it's the educators. So that notion of always bringing in the experiences and expectations of everyone. And I just wanted to tell a little bit of a quick story here about, what have families got to say about these issues. Families are living these issues. Families are living the digital world. So in a study we're doing at the moment, we just had a little example come up. Do you all know about Huggy Wuggy? Does anyone know about Huggy Wuggy? So if you've got your phone there, you might just want to Google Huggy Wuggy so you can see what he looks like. So Huggy Wuggy is a character. Louise, you're looking really worried. Huggy Wuggy is a character in an online game that's nominally for older children or adults, but everything that now is for older children and adults permeates into the content that young children are on YouTube Kids or wherever they are. So Huggy Wuggy is a character in a factory game, and if he catches you, he will hug you so hard, Julian, he'll hug you until your head pops off and you will die.
We've all got fantasies.
Huggy Wuggy, right? So just recently in this study, have you found him? Yeah, that's Huggy. So he's got animal teeth, and then behind his animal teeth are human teeth. So in this example, in a kindergarten, a 4-year-old came to kindergarten wearing a Huggy Wuggy t-shirt that the parents had bought, and then proceeded to tell all the other children about Huggy Wuggy, and not only tell the other children about Huggy Wuggy, but to chase them in the playground as if they were a Huggy Wuggy, because they were wearing a Huggy Wuggy t-shirt, and that they were going to squeeze everyone until their heads popped off and all your classmates are effectively dead. So then there's a bit of uproar amongst all the other families because they don't want their children knowing about Huggy Wuggy. Exactly the same thing happened with Squid Games. Yeah? So the families already know that it's a Wild West. We cannot pretend that a 3 or 4-year-old is safe. So the families want to be invited into the conversation. I'm finishing, Julian. They want to be invited in to the conversation as well. There we go. I was a bit over time, sorry.
That's great. No, thank you very much indeed, Susie. That's great. So the way we've arranged this is we're going to give all the other panelists a couple of minutes each to respond to either Susie's responses or in the other panelists' responses, as it were, to create a medley of voices here. So and then I'm not worried. And then after we've had that, then we're going to invite Rebecca Ng to come and talk a little bit about some of the work the centre has been doing, and then we'll open it out to the floor for questions. So I'm sorry, Annie, but you're sitting next to me. So your chance to any observations you want to make on comments that you heard, or responses, or criticisms, or whatever.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things I was going to pick up on was what Annabel said about having early educators in the decision room. And it's not really always easy to either, particularly with COVID and lockdowns and everything. But it's something really important. And I think it's definitely, when you're starting in a small business and building it up, it's really important to take the time to do these things, but they don't happen really quickly. And I think that's something that's good to reflect on. One of the things that we did was to be like, something's got to start from somewhere, and for us it happened with our daughter. But I think probably one of the most important things I feel like I did as a company, and it's a little bit unusual for education technology for a company to do it, is we went out and ran trials. And so we partnered with Good Start Early Learning. And while we are predominantly a product for children to use at home, and most of the children use their NDIS funding, so it was great you mentioned that, to purchase us, it's not easy to understand that the triad situation when you've got a person at home with a parent that you can't reach, particularly during a lockdown where you can't visit. So what we were able to do was then to partner with early learning centres, and we had just over 1,700 kids across multiple sites in early learning, and then they were able to trial it, and we had to step back and watch how it was being used. And that's why I was really interested on what you were talking about, like, because you go in with an intent on how you think it's going to be used, and then watch how someone else uses it. And what we worked out is that we needed to run development programs with educators, because the educator, as well as the parent, is the most pivotal person in that child's language development. And what we saw straight away was that people were using technology like iPads to replace the time with the children. And when a child had a communication issue, they were more difficult. And so they were more likely to do it more often. And actually this has a negative impact on their development. And so what we started to do was, how do we develop our program and our technology so that we're using a technology tool that actually increases the dialogue between the child and the parent, and the child and the educator, and how do we do that? And so that's how we used our training programs that happened through professional development. But we've also started to streamline that so that we can use what we learnt with educators to help parents. And also, we don't want to make it more stressful, but we do it subtly, so that maybe they don't know that it's about to be work for them, but it's going to be a wonderful type of work, because it involves more communication and learning about your child and what favourite colour they've got, and it's going to make everything easier. And for us, that was something that was really important of the technology, because it's not just the technology, but it's that wraparound, and how it fits into the culture, how it fits into our education system, and how it fits with that parent. And that the child sits in more than one place in their world. They're not just at home. They're at school, and the two have got to interlink, and they've got to talk to each other in that way. And the last thing I was going to say is that one of the things that struck me the most working with early education system was that the predominant amount of products that I started seeing, particularly technology, had been made for atypical developing children, and then applied for children with disabilities. And this is a really problematic approach, because if you think about a picture of a school, and you think about some stairs and a ramp, and if you've got funding, you should build the ramp, because everybody can use the ramp. And that's the point that I guess we work in terms of why I get up and talk, Because what we do is not just about making a difference for the child's lives, but it's about advocacy and about making sure that the money that's spent in those early education system is helping every child, and every child means those children with disability. And that it should come from there, because what we found is that our technology actually improves significantly the development of children who don't have a disability as well. And more importantly, it helps them interact and make friends with children that do have disabilities. And they're better for that. And that's the future that I want to be part of, and why we choose to do that wraparound service with the technology, because it means that we know we've got some level of play in what the future we want to create.
Super. Thank you very much indeed. Mark, and in the interests of fairness, I should say our company is called Xplor rather than Explorer, or...
We call our team Explorers. We've got a company called Xplor. We can't spell either way, so I'm not too fazed by it. But,
cool, thank you.
I'll keep it super short, but we learnt a lot of the things that were said, and I love listening to people that have been in the sector for so long, because I'm not, and I learn a lot. But we struggled with the observations and digitising observations for everything that you spoke about, for all those reasons. So we had to go back to the drawing board many times. And then something that I had to learn very early on was that triad, and really solving each problem as an individual problem, but then trying to stitch it all together of why we solve. We don't build anything for children. We don't build apps for children or anything. It's a really lost opportunity because we could. But we work with educators, we work with parents, we work with administrators in a centre, because they've all got different problems, but they're all trying to work to that same common goal. So that's something that we've had to do a lot of, direct educator workshops, direct centre owner workshops, direct parent workshops, and trying to figure out what every single person wants for this one outcome. So I was super impressed.
Thanks ever so much, Mark. Simon, do you want to...
I just have, when you mentioned a very pressing point about equity of access, and that's one of the key pillars that Google has, which is that everybody should be able to have access to technology, to search, to learning. And that's one of the major things that we are pushing for in an education perspective. That the world over, there are marginalised communities, there are communities with intermittent access. And part of what we like to do, what Google likes to do, is be able to help those communities get access to both the technology and the ability to learn. We have, there's a new OS, so Chrome OS can be utilised on any old device. So if you have an old laptop or an old MacBook, you can install this Chrome OS, Chrome Flex. And it basically means that there are a myriad of old computers that can now be reutilised and repurposed to give to lower socioeconomic communities or people that don't have access to technology, and give them the ability to then start their learning journey with technologies. That was another thing that I just wanted to mention from an equity of access perspective. But otherwise, everybody else has been magnificent today. I feel like the schlub that's up here.
No comment. Annabel, do you...
Well, I'm just very conscious that there are developers looking, listening to the experiences of all of the people here on the panel, and looking for the opportunities. But I feel like there's a big unspoken thing, and I think that you touched on it, Susie, about one of the biggest challenges is about thinking about this binary of, okay, technology is good, technology is bad. And the elephant in the room, of course, is the big discussion around screen time, which is, look, to me, is, that's part of the news cycle. It's a very popular sort of topic that, resonates with teachers, it resonates with parents, and I think, developers have to be aware of it as well. So the challenges for developers is that I think that they do have to understand the very real concerns of parents and educators around screen time. But conversely, I think educators and parents need to understand screen time as well. And a colleague of mine, Dr Jocelyn Brewer, she talks about digital nutrition, and she talks about very reasonable approaches to talk about screen time with your family and with your students as well. I definitely recommend you to look her up and look at some of her writings. So I think for developers, the challenge is, okay, well, how do you assuage or how do you persuade parents and educators that your app is not going to, take your child away and you're never going to see them again? So I think that's why it's important to work with the parents and with the educators. For the educators, I think there's that binary as well. Well, technology can't replace me. We know technology can't replace a teacher. Okay, it's an enhancement. So what are the ways that educators can learn to see the benefits of technology? And for parents, it's the same thing too. For them, for a generation of parents, screen time it's always going to be, it's a very easy topic to make a news topic about. It's very sticky. I grew up with a television in my bedroom. I think I turned out all right. But I didn't have an iPad. But my children were gamers and have always been gamers. But it's about the way that you actually understand what's good screen time, what's bad screen time, what technology can actually enable you to be creative and to be curious. And I'm just going to end on this personal note that last night my daughter, who's 16, and she's a gamer, she's online all the time, making things, she plays lots of online games. But this, she brought this down. This is a journal that she keeps, so I've got her permission to bring this in. But she's also flagged the bits that I can show because I'm not allowed to read the rest of it. But she does some visual journaling. But she was explaining to my friend last night that she uses an app that connects her Pinterest board and actually creates collages for them. But then she goes off and makes her own collages, but she uses the app for the inspiration. And so she actually physically prints out what the app spits out, but then creates her own collage creations as well. So, I just want to really dispel the myth. I think technology can be very empowering and it can be very useful to, spark curiosity and to enable creativity. So I'll end on that note.
Okay, thanks very much, Annabel. Susie, I'm going to come back to you at the end rather than now. So thanks so much. So colleagues at the University of Wollongong and Deakin here, as part of the Centre of Excellence, have been trying to think about ways in which we might be able to support the quality of the conversation between developers, between schools, between parents, between teachers, and all the different kind of players that we've heard about so much. So very briefly, Rebecca Ng is going to come and present to you our attempt to, she'll explain better than I, a sort of design prototype that we've thought might be useful as a way of helping this kind of conversation keep going and for people to become informed. Because as you'll have heard tonight, the conversation between all these parties isn't always easy. And we've taken the responsibility at the centre to try to promote a higher quality of conversation so that people can understand more about the worlds that are the apps and the worlds that they're inhabiting, because there is so often so much difficulty and anxiety, as we've heard from so many of the presenters tonight. So I'll hand over to Rebecca now for 5-10 minutes.
I agree with you, Annie. Short, small, but fantastic. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm actually going to introduce to you what we're going to call, or what we currently call, the EdTech database. I don't think we can drop the vowels and have a cool name like Xplor. It'd be fantastic. But if you have a good idea for a name, please come and have a chat after this. So what is the EdTech database? Well, the EdTech database is a collection, curation, and evaluation of publicly available information about educational technologies and at-home educational apps used with Australian children from birth to 8. So I think, we had a fantastic kind of lineup with the panelists, and they talked about a few things. For example, Simon, I think you mentioned that there's so much access to information, so much access to apps. And then Annabel, you said, well, how do we know what a good app is, or what's, what is beneficial for? And I think that's what's facing a lot of us. We are all spoiled for choice in terms of the digital technologies that we have, and what should we choose for our children? So we did some interviews, and in our initial interviews with parents and educators, some comments, and this really aligned with what you talked about, Susie. The first thing that came to me was, there's a lack of professional development for educators about the types of apps suitable for children that I can recommend. And then there is this other comment that is, there's vast quantity, not reliability, quantity and diversity of opinions around topics such as screen time. So I guess one of the aims of the EdTech database is to support families. And it's this idea that we're talking about here is to bring everyone together. It's to support families, educators, and earlier centres to make informed decisions when selecting digital tools, platforms, and apps for children. And I think it is important to note that while we will include as many apps or EdTech as possible, this database is not so much a repository as it is an artifact for design intervention. And that is to activate people's capacity for critical evaluation of digital technologies and apps and help them make better choices for their children, for our children. And as I mentioned, and I think everyone here is fantastic, I would love to work with everyone here. One of the things that we find very difficult is to actually get everyone on board having discussions, conversations, our industry partners, our developers, our educators. And so one of the things we want to do is to encourage more open conversations with everyone to improve educational experience and the ethical use of data on these platforms or apps. And ultimately, we hope that this database can inform policymaking towards supporting and regulating digital technologies used in education. So, I'm trying to work out how to use this. All right, here, so this is our first design prototype of the EdTech database. It's a bit small, so, we can have a chat about this afterwards, but it is a website that's going to be optimized, for web and mobile browsing. We hope that the initial launch of it will happen early 2023, and that, for the first instance, we will have it targeted for parents and educators, and in time, hopefully industry, government partners, etc. So it will start with a select number of popular EdTech used in formal educational settings. I know you can't see, but in the middle, we sort of have this it's actually our logo there. And we are actually hoping that this is not just a Centre of Excellence project. We are hoping to engage with a few government and not-for-profit agencies, as well as industry partners, to actually co-develop this database with us. So if you're interested, please let us know. Well, talk to Julian. We will also be, so aside from that, we will also be providing, our different stakeholders with research-informed resources around the use of digital technologies. And these will include sort of perspectives from health, education, digital citizenship, and data privacy. So the highlight of the database is actually the actual information that we're going to talk about of each product. And there will be a little bit of before that, please note that the information on the next 2 pages are just for demonstration purposes and may not necessarily relate to the specific products that we are talking about. But we thought that we should be using actual products so that we know, we can relate to them because we use them and we know them. So on each of these specific pages, there will be a standardized template to show publicly available information, as you can see on the screen. And this information is to provide context so that it's easy to understand and comparable with other products. So one of the things I think we mentioned is we don't really know what each of the products do when we look at their sites. Sometimes, it's very vague to us. So how can we have a bit of a standardized language around that? And that's what the database will do. We will also, I know it's a little bit small, but on the tabs you will see that there's sort of information on educational approach. We will talk to experts like Susie and Julian around kind of what the educational approach of the app is and have a bit of a case study around that, as well as some ratings against objective metrics, which will be also available on the site. And there will be a bit of a comparison page so that it can help parents or educators make some informed decisions when they are looking at this products side by side to see whether it fits their needs. Again, information here for demonstration purposes only. Aside from kind of this public available information, I want to draw attention to the bottom 2 blocks. I know you can't really see very well, but they are the examples of ratings that we'll be providing for each product, which includes the educational approach, such as whether it is a creative platform or whether it is very much content-based, and as well as an evaluation of the product's privacy policy, such as its collection and sharing of personal information. So the next step for this project is to engage with suitable partners and consult with stakeholders. The team and I are currently interviewing parents and educators about their views around the EdTech database, and it has been extremely, extremely insightful. So I would absolutely love to talk to every one of you here about this, just to get your views. We are hoping to consult or partner with members of the industry, developers, government, and not-for-profit agencies next to get feedback and co-develop the database. So any ideas, questions, anything at all, please, let's have a chat. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. As you can all see, there's been a very wide range of issues, themes, concepts, products, and relationships between any or all of those throughout the evening, and that also characterizes the range and scope of this particular subject, the relationship in a way about EdTech and learning in general. So we've now got 10-15 minutes for questions from the floor and also questions from online, which is slightly tricky to manage, so I'm going to rely on Andy and Loretta feeding those questions to me. But do any of you in the audience have any questions you'd like to put to any or all members of the panel? And I think, well, we'll see a bit how it goes, but I might ask, we might have the questions and then wait, or we might, depends exactly, I can't quite tell yet, so if that's okay. So has anybody got any questions they want to kick off with? And are there any coming through from online? We have mics, I think. Okay, so Jill in the front.
I'm just very interested. You talk about the parents, you talk about the designers, but surely it's what kids do with these apps, not just the parents. So where are the children in this? Because you're talking up to ages 8. They have agency. So where is the agency of those children in either co-designing or working with, or how they... what are their practices with these apps? Because, I mean, I was involved with a project around iPads and how young kids, and some of them with disabilities, intellectual and physical disabilities, but also those that were not, and they were unbelievably active in terms of the ways in which they constructed and changed how it was used, yeah.
Oh, well, I
do
have an opinion on this, because I think, especially with educational apps, Jill, is it? Yeah, especially with educational apps, I feel that it comes back to that binary. Oh, it's got to have an educational outcome. It has a literacy outcome. It has a numeracy outcome. Oh, it teaches me about ancient history. And that's, but the child might use the app in a completely different way. Or they might become more creative, or they might actually teach us, well, I'm learning this by using it in this particular way. So I think, so where are the children in this? They have to be in there at the sort of, production stage. But I think we also have to give credit to the children to be able to inform us as educators and as parents as well, that the learning education doesn't just stop at the literacy and numeracy and the NAPLAN results or whatever the early childhood framework. It goes way beyond that. And really what we wanted to be able to do, what I would hope educational or apps do, or content does, is inspires a curiosity for lifelong learning. And that's not just for 0 to 8, that's to up to 90 years old, yeah. Or beyond.
Thanks. I know other people might have a comment to make, but I'm also very keen to get feedback and from this very shy and retiring audience. Does anybody have any other questions, or do they just like being talked at? Susan.
I'd like to follow on from your comment, Jill, about the children, and also pick up on the idea of apps and education. I've talked to a lot of educators, a lot of teachers over many years, and with their best intentions, they inform parents of the kinds of apps that should be used. And then particularly when you work within communities where there's not a lot of money, the parents are looking for ways to both engage with apps and technology, but at the same time do educational work. And so what happens are these children using these absolutely horrendous phonics and numeral games that are boring and rote and actually not engaging at all. And I'm really curious about those of you who work in design about ways that we can engage further in that. We know we've got some fantastic games like Minecraft and so on that do that and are named as educational games, but there's so much work to be done in this space. And I take your point, Annabel, about, we don't want edutainment. We want curiosity, imagination, all kinds of learning across the spectrum of experience. So I'd be interested to hear the panel here to help us kind of try and solve this as an educational problem.
Go on, you go, Annie, go on.
Okay, I'm happy to. I spent a lot of time with kids. And in fact, 3-year-olds named our company, which was a big risk because we could have ended up with something really interesting. But I love hearing the opinions of kids. And a lot of our game development is made based on what children would want to do. And it's really interesting because I ask the educators, what do you want next? And they say phonics. And then I ask the kids and they say, I'd really like marine animals. And I'd like to know, something, there's like some sort of dolphin with a unicorn on its head. I'd like to know more about that. Or did you know that there are 7 species of stingrays? And I'm like, no, I did not know, but I'll be back to you on that one. and I think it's one of the things that they just surprise and delight me by what they're interested in, and that those interests fuel the learning. And I think the biggest outcome we know from when we're looking at language development and long-term memory of that is if they have the attention, then you remember. So I don't think it matters what sometimes they're learning, as long as they're interested and they're passionate. And I get that too. I like that. Yeah.
Go on, Susie, you got...
I think that's a very important question. And so to grapple at that in a different way, right? Because we've already been doing this for so long. I invite you to think about what does that problem look like as a technical code, right? So if the philosophy of technology tells us that people will take a new tech and absorb it into what they already know, that's exactly what's happening with educational apps. They've become a technical code. So we think education is teaching. The technology has come up with the capacity for an app, therefore we make really boring educational apps. And so now we've got this problem of educational apps or a technical code, because what's happened is the historical practice has merged with the capacity of the technology, right? But what Feenberg talks about is once you've identified a technical code, thank God there's hope, right? So we're not just stuck, right? That the very identification of a technical code means that then you can look how to break it. So the problem isn't on the fact that we're using these apps. You have to go, okay, if educational apps are shit, right, a lot of them, then how are you going to break that as a technical code? Who do you need to invite into the breaking of the technical code so that you realise the technology in a new way? Yeah, and I think that you can see technical codes in all of this conversation. Screen time is a technical code because the screens became mobile. You could watch them and use them wherever, but the only mindset we had for thinking about the screen was the TV, which was tied and plugged into one room and attached to time. So then we've come up with screen time. We've made it a big problem, but it's not, it's just a technical code. So how are you going to smash the technical code? You think about screen practices.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to exert what minimal authority I have. We've got two questions, one at the back and one at the front. So to the back first, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Tara from ClickView. I work in an EdTech company, so I was really interested to hear what you guys had to say today. But I'm really interested in the EdTech database and that coming along. I think that's great. Is that going to be aspirationally just for Australia, or sorry, is it just Australia or aspirationally for the world? Because there's so many products that I know are used in education that are not Australian. They're just not.
Do you mind if shall I, since it's
So I'm really
in the beginning, Australia, but of course you raised a very difficult challenge, which is that the concept of national borders in the development of different kinds of software has gone to pot. So what it means to talk about a company being Australian, what it means to talk about an audience being Australian, you know, we've got Google on the panel here today. You know, what do those kind of definitions mean in terms of boundaries? So in the first instance, the iteration is to focus on what Australian families will have access to, because we're focusing on that market. But the point is a good one about the broader context.
Yeah.
If you sorry to do that, but
no,
I knew the answer to that one. And then we've got a question at the front here.
Hello. So sticking, I suppose, with the theme of the EdTech database, and on the idea of kind of triage and co-design as well, one of the things that I've experienced from talking to young people, so ages kind of 7 to 8, talking to parents of very young children and talking to principals as well, is that in various different ways, their concerns are not so much with these kind of huge ideas of identifiable data. Somebody said to me recently that they're not actually very worried about photos of their children, for example. What they're worried about are the tiny bytes of data and these very small, seemingly insignificant parts of data which build up to a larger, like, fuzzy kind of profile, and this especially speaks to kind of ideas around very sensitive medical data and how that can be then later used to kind of profile their children for higher insurance premiums or to exclude them entirely, for example. But as I say, 7 to 8-year-old children have expressed to me concern about small pieces of data from an app that they use sometimes in English will determine whether or not they get into university. And it was they felt this concern, and they brought it up to me in multiple different focus groups. So to return to this kind of idea of triage, and to not just talk about education and fun, but to talk about business, is there a way in which you communicate or think about communicating privacy and handling of data and collection of data in the first place? Because to say handling assumes that you will collect data to different parties and to work with them, to communicate with them in ways that is suitable for them, that isn't just a kind of alienating long legal document. So again, to talk to principals, to talk to parents, to talk to young people, whether they're 0 to 8 or 11 to 18 or anything in between. So yeah, it's just about those, again, different stakeholders and from a different side of the business.
I've got a very short part of what I can say about that. From a Google perspective, your data is yours. It's not ours. We don't own it. It is always the user's data that remains with the user's ownership. We don't access it. We access the metadata conversation, which I'm guessing is, like, to distill it down, that's the concern from these kids. It's terrible that 7 and 8-year-olds are worried about this. I mean, that's an awful thing to have to think about. But like I said, from a Google perspective, your data is always yours. It remains in your ownership. You can access it whenever you need to, and you can delete it as need. So that's the one very minor thing that I'm allowed to say about that. But yeah, that's a really terrifying thought that little kids are dealing with.
Or an encouraging reflection on the Australian education system. Mark and Annie, do you want to respond to the metadata or data question or not?
Not really, but no, it's a good conversation, and I've been having this conversation, especially about, dare I say it, blockchain and Web3. Now, if you think about some of the data that we're using, like actually, I'll backtrack a bit. Like, there's this whole argument about children agency and all the rest of it, but ultimately, parents are posting, and I do it, thousands of images on Facebook and social medias. I don't call out Facebook, but social media. Signing them up to 1,000 different platforms with no control over it. So what if, and this is something we're exploring, no pun, is, what if the child actually owned the data and they allowed, the parent had access to the data until they turned 18, and then the child owned their data and they could revoke it at any time and had control over it. That's what blockchain and this whole world of Web3 could be used for. And that's something we're really looking at, because that means they've now, they've got no choice now, but that's your legal problem as a child. Until you're 18, you don't have any control over that. But when you turn 18, you can revoke it. So there's some of the things that we're looking at. And that's, to me, like a technology solution, again, for something that is going to become a serious issue.
Thanks very much. Do you want to say anything about data?
Yeah, happy to, because I think it's a really important topic, and it's good that you brought it up. I think sometimes the ignoring it and putting your head in the sand around when you build technology and everything and thinking I'll deal with it later when I have more money or things like that is the wrong choice. And it's really hard to go back and build proper data sets that do protect and partnering up to make sure that where the data is stored, won't have an impact on that child. Yeah, so interesting, because I remember one of the research projects I worked on in America was a metadata, and it was around publishing on a cohort in America that were more likely to have strokes, and it got published as part of a big cohort that I was involved in, and it changed insurance prices. And I think for me, that was the first time I was a PhD student that I felt like, knowledge translation is great, but when it impacts people in their real life, not just hypothetically what they're going to read as a theory online, that's really serious. And I think it was a good learning curve that I was a student to go through that, because then when building this technology, you can think about those things. And it's something that we should talk about more. And if kids are discussing it, we should be able to address it. And who owns that data? Yeah.
Thanks very much indeed. Are there any questions from online?
Professor Tamaliva, Chief Investigator of the Center at Curtin University, asked, especially for the developers on the panel, given the amount of new apps that entered the market during COVID-19, in what ways do you help parents and educators know that your technologies have educational credentials? How do you communicate that credibility before the technologies are used or downloaded?
Well, from the ABC's perspective, we have to always consult with the education department and with educators, and we have at ABC Education, we know that the teacher is first. So if the teacher scrutinises the content that we make and it doesn't match their educational needs, the context, or doesn't match to the curriculum, we know that it won't be used. So that's why that consultation is very important. But it's also about balancing it as well.
Thanks, Anna. There's a question about credentials in a sense, right? Do you want to?
I have a very, naive view of it, and it's a product view. If your product's bad, people won't use it. And so that's the feedback. Not saying that we're purposely releasing bad products, that we're trying to do everything we possibly can not to. That's why we consult and work with 1,000 different people. But in the long run, a successful business will be based on if someone's going to use it. So if the educators are using it, and they're going to provide ways, and we've had ways and channels of them to provide feedback as they're using it, and continuously iterate on those products, then, it's sort of that yes or no conversation. For us, the product's never done. It's always been worked on. It will always be improved. It will always be fixed. So we might get it wrong on a release, but we'll fix it. And we'll keep fixing it until we get it right. So we don't have those types of credentials or process, but it's from years and years of work with families and educators and just people in general.
You took the answer literally out of my mouth, figuratively out of my mouth. Basically the same thing. Iterative change through applications, through platforms, through services is what makes things better. You have, over time, you have a better product because of development of impact of feedback from users. And that's the most important part of what we're doing. One of the most important things that we do is to make the products that people want to use in an easy manner.
Thanks so much. So look, one of the pleasures of partnering with ACMI is their splendid canapes and drinks, which now follow this event. But can I just do a party game and then just ask all of you to have one more sentence if you want to contribute to the debate, or is that just too awful for words? Okay, we're going to go for it. So Simon, you can go first. And a final sentence.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to ask for it, I think. Education is the most important thing for everybody. Being able to access it, it's equally important. Simple as that.
Okay. You guys don't want to play. I think that's perfectly reasonable.
Look, I just want to say that I think there's also an identifiable chasm between early childhood education and K-12 education, and trying to sort of work out and manage that gap. Like, I mean, that obviously takes a big systemic change, but I'm kind of hopeful that technology will help us in that.
Thanks so much for that comment. Do you guys, I'm not really mean, but go for it if you want to.
Ooh, pressure. Okay, I'm thinking about the themes that we've been talking about in early childhood education weeks around play. And I know that we talk about the importance of play, but I'm going to say play is how we learn. And the more play that we do and the more play that we involve our whole body in, the better persons we are for it, whether we are, you know, a baby, whether we're a toddler, or whether we're older like me. Play is so valuable and important for us.
Thanks ever so much. Mark, are you going to...
Well, if everyone else has spoken.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, this is really cool. I'm an optimist at heart, so it's great to see people in the room trying to solve some of the challenges that we've got into the future.
Thanks. And Susie?
Actually wordless.
We don't believe that.
Oh, serious? Can I just leave it as wordless?
Wordless. Okay, all right. So listen, I'd like to thank Loretta and Andy and Rebecca and Gavin, who work behind the scenes putting this event on. I also want to send thanks to Christine, who's sitting over there from ACMI, for hosting, partnering with us as the centre evolves and develops. I'd like to thank you all very much for contributing to this discussion. At times, I think it's fair to say it isn't always easy. There are differences, you know, big differences. Quite simply, without sounding too banal, the more that we can sit down and talk these things through, the better the possible understanding, the better the possible range of outcomes is likely to be. So I want to thank you all for giving up your time. I don't know whether the canapé compensate for time or how you calculate that. And then I'd now like to invite you all to join us to mingle and to network and to enjoy the rest of the evening. So thank you very much indeed.